Non-stop bells. The horror of Outpost Echo-7. There are places in this world, tucked away in the folds of ancient maps and forgotten by the relentless march of time, that operate on a different set of principles. They are governed by laws not written in any legal codex, but whispered on the wind and etched into the very soul of the land itself. These are the places we monitor. These are the places we protect. And for these places we have protocols. They are not suggestions. They are not guidelines to be interpreted. They are absolute. They are the thin, unyielding line between order and an older, more patient chaos. They are the distilled wisdom of those who came before, men and women who learned the hard way that nature, in its purest form, is not always welcoming. Welcome back to the Wilderness Protocol. Tonight's debriefing concerns a remote sector in the Northern Territories, a sprawling expanse of primordial forest and granite peaks designated as Outpost Echo-7, and it concerns the last ranger assigned to that post. His name was Arthur Vance. He was young, capable, and confident, perhaps too confident. He was given the protocol, he acknowledged the protocol, and then, in a single fateful act of defiance, he chose to ignore it. What follows is a reconstruction of the events leading up to and following his breach. It is a testament to why our rules exist. It is a cautionary tale, a stark reminder that some warnings are written in blood for a reason. This is the story of why the new ranger refused to follow the protocol, and why, for 72 agonizing hours, the bells at Echo-7 began to ring, and did not stop. Arthur Vance was, by all accounts, an exemplary candidate. He came to us with a stellar record from the Forestry Service, a background in search and rescue, and a psychological profile that screamed resilience. He was resourceful, physically fit, and possessed a sharp, analytical mind. He saw the world in black and white, in problems and solutions. The gray areas, the spaces filled with superstition and folklore, were, to him, simply a lack of information. A problem waiting to be solved by logic. His assignment to Echo-7 was considered a promotion, a posting of significant trust. Echo-7 is not a park for tourists. There are no manicured trails, no designated campsites, no friendly visitor centers. It is a containment zone, a vast wilderness preserve where nature is left utterly and completely to its own devices. Our role there is not to manage the wilderness, but to manage the boundary between it and the outside world, to ensure that what is inside stays inside. The briefing for Echo-7 is unlike any other. It is conducted in a secure room, with no electronics permitted. The outgoing ranger, a man named Elias Thorne, delivered it himself. Elias was a veteran of the service, a man whose face was a roadmap of harsh suns and harder winters. His eyes held a weary gravity that Arthur, in his youthful certainty, mistook for simple fatigue. The protocol for Echo-7 was contained in a single, leather-bound folio. It was filled with topographical maps, emergency procedures, and communication schedules. But tucked into the final sleeve was a single typewritten page, yellowed with age. It was titled simply, "The Chapel Rules." Elias slid the page across the polished table. "You read this one twice, kid," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Then you read it again." Arthur picked it up. The rules were simple yet deeply strange. 1. Primary patrols are to be conducted between sunrise and sunset. No exceptions. 2. The structure designated the Old Chapel in Sector Gamma is off-limits for overnight stays. 3. Visual inspection of the chapel is permitted, but entry is to be avoided unless structurally necessary. 4. The bell located in the chapel steeple is not to be rung, under any circumstances, for any reason. 5. If you hear the bell ring, you are to return to the main cabin immediately. Do not deviate from your course. Do not investigate the source. 6. Upon returning to the cabin, secure all doors and windows. Activate the secondary generator. Do not respond to any sounds or voices from outside until the ringing has ceased for a full daylight cycle. Arthur read the list, a small, incredulous smile touching his lips. He looked up at Elias. The bell? You're serious? Elias didn't smile back. As a cardiac arrest. It's a joke, right? Arthur pressed. A hazing ritual for the new guy. Don't ring the spooky bell? There is no hazing in the protocol, Mr. Vance, Elias stated, his tone flat and cold. Every rule in that book, every single line, was put there because someone died finding out why it was necessary. That page most of all. Arthur's smile faded, replaced by a look of professional curiosity. Okay, so what's the story? Why the rule? Is the bell structurally unsound? Worried it'll bring the steeple down. He was searching for a logical explanation, a rational variable to plug into his equation of the world. Elias leaned back, his chair groaning in protest. The story isn't important. The rule is. The why doesn't matter. The what does. You don't ring the bell. That's all you need to know. But for Arthur Vance, that was never enough. His mind was already working, dissecting the absurdity of it. A bell. A simple, archaic signaling device. The rule was an affront to his logical worldview. It was a piece of nonsensical folklore standing in the way of practical sense. Perhaps the bell was a historical artifact? An untested variable in an otherwise controlled environment? His mind catalogued the possibilities, each one more rational than the last. He dismissed the warning as the ramblings of an old man who'd spent too much time alone in the woods. He signed the acknowledgement form, his signature a clean, confident slash of ink. He accepted the keys to the cabin and the truck. He shook Elias Thorne's hand, a firm, dismissive gesture. As Arthur turned to leave, Elias spoke one last time, his voice barely a whisper, yet it cut through the silence of the room. "Kid," he said. Arthur stopped, but didn't turn around. "I hope you're as smart as you think you are, because the woods don't care about your logic. And that bell, it doesn't make a sound. It asks a question, and you don't want to be around to hear the answer." Arthur left the room without another word. The old man's cryptic warning was, to him, just noise, the last gasp of a bygone, superstitious era. He was wrong. He was tragically, catastrophically wrong. The first 2 weeks at Echo-7 were idyllic for Arthur. He fell into the rhythm of the wilderness with an easy confidence. He was meticulous in his duties, mapping animal trails, checking perimeter fences, and filing his daily reports with an efficiency that was noted by regional command. The solitude didn't bother him. It fueled him. He felt a sense of mastery over the vast, silent landscape. He was the king of his own private kingdom. The air was clean, the silence profound, broken only by the cry of a hawk or the rustle of unseen things in the undergrowth. The main cabin was sturdy and well-stocked, a bastion of cozy civilization against the untamed wild. Arthur felt vindicated. The old ranger, Elias, had clearly been spooked by shadows, a man on the verge of retirement letting his imagination get the better of him. On the 15th day of his posting, his patrol route took him deep into Sector Gamma. It was a part of the preserve he hadn't yet explored, a region of older, denser forest where the sunlight struggled to pierce the thick canopy. The trees here were ancient behemoths, their bark like wrinkled skin, their branches like gnarled arms reaching for the sky. And then he saw it. Through a break in the trees, standing in a small, unnaturally clear meadow, was the old chapel. It was a simple colonial-era structure, built of dark, weathered wood and local stone. It wasn't grand, but it had a severe, imposing presence. A small, crooked steeple, green with moss, pointed a skeletal finger at the sky. It was dilapidated, certainly. The roof was sagging in places, and several windows were boarded up. But it was far from being a ruin. It was a place that felt expectant. Waiting. Arthur dismounted from his ATV, his boots crunching on the dry leaves. He walked the perimeter just as the protocol allowed. He noted the state of the foundation, the overgrowth of ivy on the north wall. It was all very mundane, very normal. And then his eyes were drawn to the steeple. Through a gap in the wooden slats, he could see it. The bell. It was larger than he'd expected, cast from a dark, lusterless bronze that seemed to drink the light. It hung perfectly still, a silent, brooding pendulum in the heart of the chapel. He stood there for a long time, the old ranger's words echoing in his mind. Don't ring the bell. That's all you need to know. What an absurd, childish prohibition. What could possibly happen? A flock of birds might be startled. A weak timber might shudder. He was a man of science, of cause and effect. The idea that this simple object held some sort of supernatural power was an insult to his intelligence. It was a loose thread in the fabric of his orderly world, and it needed to be pulled. He needed to prove it was just a bell, to debunk the myth, to close the file on this ridiculous piece of folklore so he could focus on the real work. He found the main doors of the chapel. They were swollen shut with damp and age, but not locked. Putting his shoulder into it, he forced one of the doors open with a groan of protesting wood. The air that rushed out was cold and musty, thick with the smell of decay and something else, something metallic and vaguely unpleasant, like old blood. The interior was dark, choked with dust and cobwebs. Pews lay overturned, and a thick layer of grime covered everything. Sunlight struggled through the grimy windows, illuminating dancing dust motes in the gloom. His focus was singular. He saw the bell rope, thick and frayed, hanging down from the ceiling in the center of the nave. It disappeared up into the darkness of the steeple. This was it, the moment to replace superstition with fact. He walked to the center of the room, his footsteps echoing in the oppressive silence. He took hold of the rope. It felt stiff and greasy in his hands. He braced himself, planting his feet. He was not just pulling a rope. He was vanquishing a ghost. He was asserting the dominance of the rational world over the shadows of the old one. With a grunt of exertion, he pulled. The rope was heavy, resistant. It took all his weight to move it. High above, there was a scraping sound of metal on metal, a sound of ancient mechanisms being forced into motion after a long, long slumber. And then the sound. It was not the clear, resonant peal he had expected. It was a deep, guttural, clanging toll. A dead sound, a sick sound. It didn't ring out across the landscape. It seemed to fall from the steeple and soak into the ground, vibrating up through the soles of his boots. Clang. Just once. A single, discordant note that hung in the air for a moment before being swallowed by the silence. Arthur let go of the rope, a strange feeling washing over him. It wasn't fear. It was disappointment. That was it? A dull, ugly noise? All that ceremony, all those warnings. For that, he felt a little foolish, but also triumphant. He had done it. He had rung the forbidden bell, and the world had not ended. The sky hadn't fallen. No ancient curse had been unleashed. It was just a bell. A broken, ugly bell in a forgotten, rotting chapel. He turned and left the building, pulling the heavy door shut behind him. He didn't look back. As he walked to his ATV, he felt a weight lift from his shoulders. The mystery was solved. The protocol was a farce. He got on his vehicle and drove away, the single ugly clang already fading from his memory. He didn't notice the way the birds had fallen silent in the surrounding trees. He didn't see the way the shadows seemed to deepen in the woods around the chapel. Even though the sun was still high in the sky, he had asked the question, and the answer was coming. Arthur returned to his cabin as the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and purple. He felt a deep sense of satisfaction. He had faced the local ghost story and proven it to be nothing more than hot air. He made his dinner, filed his evening report omitting, of course, any mention of his extracurricular activities at the chapel, and settled into his armchair with a book. The silence of Echo-7 returned, vast and complete. The generator hummed its low, steady song. The fire crackled in the hearth. Everything was as it should be, orderly, rational, safe. He must have dozed off, the book slipping from his grasp. He awoke with a start, though he wasn't sure why. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, and the cabin was chilly. He glanced at the clock on the wall. 11:47 p.m. He stood up, stretching his stiff muscles, and walked to the window. The moon was high and full, casting a stark, silver light over the clearing. The trees at the edge of the forest were etched in sharp, black relief against the pale sky. It was beautiful, peaceful, and then he heard it. It was faint at first, carried on the night wind. A sound so thin he thought he might have imagined it. A trick of the ear in the profound silence. Dong. A single, clear, resonant chime. Unlike the dead clang he had produced earlier, this note was pure and impossibly clear. It rang out with a perfect, crystalline tone that seemed to cut through the night air and pierce straight into his skull. It was distant, coming from the direction of Sector Gamma, but it was completely unmistakable. It was the bell. Arthur's heart gave a sudden, hard thump against his ribs. He stood frozen at the window, straining to hear. The wind sighed through the pines. A branch scraped against the roof. Nothing. He let out a slow breath. It was the wind. It had to be. A loose fixture in the steeple, a change in air pressure. He had likely loosened something when he'd pulled the rope. It was a logical, mechanical explanation. Annoying but not alarming. He was about to turn away from the window, to dismiss it and go to bed, when it came again. Dong. Same note. Same perfect, chilling clarity. It seemed a little louder this time. A little closer. It wasn't the wind. The wind is random, chaotic. This was measured, deliberate. An icy tendril of unease snaked its way up his spine. This was impossible. He was miles away from the chapel. The sound he'd made barely traveled outside the clearing. For it to be this clear, this loud. His mind raced, desperately searching for a rational explanation. An acoustic anomaly? A temperature inversion layer in the atmosphere, carrying the sound for miles? It was plausible. Unlikely, but plausible. He waited. 1 minute. 2. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. He was just starting to relax again, to convince himself it was a fluke, when the third toll came. Dong. It was louder still. The sound vibrated in the glass of the window pane. A low, resonant hum that he felt in his teeth. It wasn't just a sound he was hearing anymore. It was a presence he could feel. And then a fourth. Dong. A fifth. Dong. Like a clock striking an impossible hour. Steady, patient, inescapable. A cold knot of dread tightened in his stomach. This was not a malfunction. This was a signal. The absurdity of the protocol suddenly evaporated, replaced by the chilling words of the old ranger, Elias. If you hear the bell ring, you are to return to the main cabin immediately. Secure all doors and windows. He was already in the cabin, but a sudden primal urge to check the locks seized him. He turned from the window and strode to the main door, his footsteps loud in the suddenly hostile silence of the cabin. He threw the heavy deadbolt. The thump of the bolt sliding home was a small, comforting sound against the vast emptiness outside. He went to the back door and did the same. Then he moved through the cabin, checking the latches on every window, his breath coming in short, sharp bursts. Dong. It was closer now. He could feel it. The sound wasn't just coming from outside anymore. It was all around him. It seemed to be emanating from the very walls of the cabin, from the floorboards beneath his feet. He remembered the next part of the rule. Activate the secondary generator. Why? The main generator was working perfectly. He looked at the humming machine in the utility closet. It was his anchor to the logical world. But the protocol was specific. He flipped the heavy switch, and with a roar, the powerful diesel backup generator kicked to life. The lights in the cabin brightened, and the sound of the new engine was a solid, reassuring wall of noise. But it wasn't enough. Dong. He could still hear it. The bell's toll cut through the roar of the generator as if it wasn't there. It was as if the sound was being made inside his own head. He stumbled back into the main room, his eyes wide, scanning the dark windows. His earlier confidence felt like a distant memory, a fool's bravado. He had pulled a lever he did not understand, and now a machine of unknown purpose was grinding into motion. The radio on his desk crackled to life, startling him so badly he cried out. Static hissed from the speaker, and then a voice cut through it. It was Elias Thorne. His voice was strained, laced with a tension that Arthur had never heard before. Vance? Art, come in. Do you copy? Arthur scrambled to the desk, grabbing the handset. Elias? Yes. Yes, I read you. What's going on? Dong. The toll of the bell punctuated his desperate question. There was a pause on the other end, and then Elias's voice came back, heavy with a terrible certainty. I was afraid of this. I can hear it even from here. Faint, but it's there. The wind is carrying it down the valley. Another pause. Art, tell me you didn't. Arthur's throat was dry. He couldn't form the words. The lie died on his lips. I was at the chapel today. You rang the bell. Elias finished for him. It wasn't a question. It was a verdict. The old ranger sighed, a sound of profound, weary resignation. God help you, son. You rang the bell. Elias, what is this? What's happening? Arthur pleaded, his voice trembling. Dong. It was faster now. The pause between the tolls was shortening. It was building a rhythm, cadence, a slow, inexorable heartbeat. Listen to me, Vance, Elias said, his voice urgent, cutting through Arthur's rising panic. You follow the rest of that protocol to the letter. You hear me? To the absolute letter. Your doors are locked. Your windows are shuttered. Yes, I did it all. Good. Now you listen. The last rule. Do not respond to any sounds or voices from outside until the ringing has ceased for a full daylight cycle. That is the most important rule of all. It's more important than breathing. Do you understand me? Voices? What voices? But before Elias could answer, the ringing changed. The slow, measured tolling stopped. For a moment, there was a blessed, terrifying silence. And then it began. A frantic, ceaseless, deafening peal. The bell was no longer tolling. It was ringing with a wild, violent, unrestrained fury. It was a sound of pure, screaming alarm. A sound that announced that something was wrong. Something was out. The bells were ringing nonstop. And through the radio, over the cacophony, Arthur heard Elias Thorne whisper a single horrified sentence. They're coming. The sound was a physical assault. It hammered at the cabin, at the windows, at the very foundations of Arthur's sanity. The non-stop ringing was a torrent of noise that drowned out everything else, the roar of the generator, the pounding of his own heart, the frantic stream of his thoughts. It was a wall of sound, and on the other side of it was a world that had suddenly become alien and predatory. "Elias! Elias! Are you there?" Arthur yelled into the radio handset. Only static answered. The connection was gone, severed by the sonic deluge or by something else. He was alone. He stumbled away from the desk, pressing his hands over his ears, a futile gesture against a sound that felt like it was boring directly into his brain. He paced the cabin like a caged animal, his eyes darting towards the shuttered windows. The protocol had been explicit. Do not respond to any sounds or voices from outside. At first, there were no other sounds. There was only the bell. It was a constant, unchanging shriek of metal. A single, maddening note repeated without pause, without breath. It was the sound of a universal fire alarm, a signal that the natural order had been breached and chaos was spilling through. Time lost its meaning. Minutes bled into hours, each second marked by 1,000 hammer strikes of the bell. Arthur's mind, once his greatest asset, his fortress of logic, began to crumble. He tried to reason, to analyze. The bell couldn't ring on its own. Someone or something had to be ringing it. Was there someone else out there? A madman living in the woods? Had he stumbled into some territorial dispute? But no human could ring a bell with such relentless, inhuman stamina. No human could create a sound that felt so profoundly wrong. After what felt like an eternity, the first new sound came. It was subtle, almost lost beneath the clangor of the bell. A soft scraping noise came from the direction of the front door. Scrape, drag, scrape. Arthur froze, his blood turning to ice water in his veins. He strained to hear over the bells. There it was again, the sound of something heavy and rough being dragged across the wooden porch. He thought of the protocol. He squeezed his eyes shut. Do not respond. He backed away from the door, his eyes wide with terror. The scraping stopped. Silence, or rather, the ever-present ringing, which now seemed to amplify the silence where the scraping had been. And then, a voice. "Hello!" It was a man's voice, sounding faint and distressed. It cut through the noise with a desperate clarity. "Hello? Is anyone in there? My name is Tom. I'm a hiker. I'm lost. I saw your light. Please, I need help." That sound. My God, that sound. I think I'm hurt. Arthur's search and rescue instincts kicked in with a powerful, gut-wrenching force. A hiker, injured and lost. This was his job. This was his purpose. He took a step toward the door, his hand reaching for the deadbolt. Do not respond to any voices from outside. Elias's warning screamed in his head, battling with his ingrained duty to help. Couldn't be a coincidence. A hiker showing up right now? Please! The voice cried out again, closer to the door now. I think my leg is broken. It's so cold. Just let me in for a minute. Please, I'm begging you. The voice was filled with pain and genuine fear. Sounded so real, so human. Arthur's hand trembled, inches from the lock. This was a test. It had to be. A cruel, elaborate test. He backed away from the door. I can't, he whispered to himself, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. I'm sorry. I can't. The pleading from outside continued for several minutes, growing more desperate, more pathetic. Arthur huddled in the center of the room, his stomach churning with guilt and terror. Finally, the voice dissolved into sobs, and then silence. But the silence was short-lived. A new sound began. A soft, rhythmic tapping on one of the shuttered windows. Tap, tap, tap. It was a gentle, almost polite sound, but in the context of the maddening bells and the disembodied voice, it was utterly terrifying. Tap, 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 tap. Arthur. He stopped breathing. It was a woman's voice this time, soft and sweet, and it had said his name. Arthur, let me in. It's cold out here. No one knew his name. Not out here. Elias knew and the regional command, but no one else. A chill that had nothing to do with the night air spread through him. How could it know his name? I know you're in there, Arthur. The voice cooed, right up against the window now. The tapping continued, patient and light. I saw you at the chapel today. I saw you ring the bell. You invited us, Arthur. It's rude not to answer the door when you've invited guests. His blood ran cold. Us? Guests? Go away! He screamed, his voice cracking. You're not real. A low, throaty chuckle came from outside the window, a sound that was far more terrifying than any scream. Not real, the voice whispered. We are more real than the ground beneath your feet, Arthur. We are the silence that was here before the trees. We are the hunger that waits in the dark. The bell doesn't make a sound. It sets a table. And we have come to feast. The tapping stopped. It was replaced by a scratching sound. The sharp, insistent scratching of fingernails or claws digging into the wood of the window shutters, seeking a way in. Arthur scrambled backwards, tripping over a rug and crashing to the floor. He crab-walked away from the window, his eyes fixed on the shuttered frame as if he could see through the wood. The incessant, hellish ringing of the bell was the soundtrack to his personal nightmare. It was the dinner bell, and he was the meal. He spent the rest of the night huddled in the farthest corner of the cabin, a heavy iron poker clutched in his white-knuckled fists. The sounds from outside grew more varied, more terrifying. He heard whispers that sounded like his mother's voice. He heard the cry of a baby. He heard the sound of something heavy bumping and thudding against the walls of the cabin, circling it, testing its defenses. And through it all, the bells rang. They rang and they rang and they rang. Promise and a threat, a beacon and a death knell. Arthur Vance, the man of logic, the man of reason, was trapped in a world that refused to obey the rules. He had broken the one rule that mattered, and in doing so, he had unmade his entire reality. The protocol wasn't about protecting the wilderness from him. It was about protecting him from the wilderness. As the first, faint hint of gray began to lighten the eastern sky, a new sound joined the cacophony. It was the sound of splintering wood. It was coming from the roof, the sun. He had to make it to sunrise. That one thought became Arthur's mantra, his only anchor in a sea of terror. The ringing of the bell was a physical weight, pressing down on him, but the first rays of dawn promised a reprieve. The protocol, the rules he had so foolishly scorned, were now his only hope. Wait until the ringing has ceased for a full daylight cycle. It had to stop at dawn. It just had to. The splintering sound from the roof was getting worse, accompanied by a heavy, dragging weight. Something was up there, something strong enough to tear through the thick timbers of the cabin roof. He could hear the sharp crack of snapping shingles and the deeper groan of the support beams. Dust and splinters of wood rained down from the ceiling. He was no longer safe. The cabin was no longer a fortress. It was a trap about to be sprung. He looked around wildly, his eyes falling on the utility closet where the generators were housed. It was small, cramped, and windowless. His door was solid oak. It wasn't much, but it was another layer of defense. Clutching the iron poker, he scrambled into the closet, pulling the heavy door shut behind him. He was plunged into near-total darkness, the only light a thin sliver from under the door. The roar of the secondary generator was deafening in the enclosed space, but even it could not completely drown out the hellish symphony from outside, the shrieking bell, the splintering wood, the chorus of whispers and scratches that now seemed to be coming from every direction at once. He wedged his back against the far wall, his legs braced against the door, adding his own weight to the lock. He was shaking uncontrollably, his teeth chattering. He was living the answer to Elias's cryptic warning. The bell doesn't make a sound. It asks a question. The question was, "Are you there?" And his foolish, arrogant ringing had answered with a resounding yes. As he sat there, entombed in the roaring, vibrating darkness, his mind, in a desperate act of self-preservation, replayed his briefing with Elias Thorne. He tried to remember every word, every nuance he had initially dismissed. He had been so focused on the what, the rule itself, that he had refused to listen to the why. And in the darkness, the why began to take shape, pieced together from the old ranger's weary tone and the grim set of his jaw. This wasn't just a random rule. It was a procedure born from tragedy. Someone else had rung the bell. He imagined a ranger like himself, perhaps years ago, a man who, on a quiet afternoon, felt the same pull of curiosity, the same defiant need to test the boundaries of a silly rule. He pictured the man pulling the rope, hearing that same dead, ugly clang. And then, later that night, hearing the first clear toll echo through the valley. But this other ranger, perhaps he wasn't as lucky. Perhaps he wasn't in his cabin. Maybe he was out on patrol when the ringing started. Or maybe he heard the voices, the pleas for help, and his compassion outweighed his fear. Maybe he opened the door. What had Elias said? Every rule in that book was put there because someone died finding out why it was necessary. Arthur finally understood. The protocol was a containment strategy. The cabin, the locks, the secondary generator, it wasn't just a shelter, it was a panic room. The generator wasn't for the lights. Its heavy, industrial roar was meant to drown out the whispers, to provide a shield of sound to protect a ranger's sanity, to help him resist the urge to listen to the voices that called from the dark. The chapel wasn't a place of worship. Not anymore. It was a cage. And the bell wasn't a bell. It was the lock. It was a warning system in reverse. It didn't warn the people of the valley that something was coming. It warned whatever was in the valley that someone was there. A fresh presence. An audience. These thoughts offered no comfort, only a terrifying clarity. The creatures outside weren't just monsters. They were opportunists. They were the ancient, patient things that the protocol was designed to keep at bay. They couldn't or wouldn't cross the boundary into our world on their own. They needed an invitation, an acknowledgement. He had rung the bell. He had sent the invitation. And now the guests had arrived, and they were tearing the house apart to get to the host. A thunderous crash from the main room shook the entire cabin, snapping him back to the present. It was a sound of final, catastrophic failure. The sound of a heavy weight breaking through the ceiling and hitting the floor. It was inside. Silence fell, except for the generator's roar and the ceaseless, triumphant ringing of the bell. The scratching, the whispers, the bumping against the wall sit all stopped. There was only the ringing and the new, terrifying silence from the main room. It was waiting. It knew he was in the closet. Arthur held his breath, listening. He could hear the soft crunch of debris under a heavy tread. A low sniffing sound. It was moving slowly, exploring the space. He pressed himself harder against the wall, trying to make himself smaller, trying to cease to exist. The doorknob to the closet began to turn. Slowly, deliberately, he watched the brass knob rotate, the latch clicking with a dreadful finality. The lock on the inside of the door was a simple bolt, not meant to withstand a determined assault. The door shuddered as something pushed against it from the other side. Thump! Arthur's heart leaped into his throat. Thump! Thump! The door bowed inwards, the wood groaning. He was out of time. He had nowhere left to run. This was the end of the line, a tomb of his own making. And then, through the cacophony, a new sound. Faint, but growing stronger. The whirring chop of helicopter blades. Help! Elias had called for help. The thing in the main room heard it too. The pressure on the door eased. He could hear it moving again. A swift, heavy shuffling towards the gaping hole in the roof. There was a scrabbling sound, and then silence once more. It was gone. The helicopter was circling overhead now, its searchlight cutting beams through the darkness outside. But it wouldn't land. Not until dawn. Arthur didn't care. He was alive. He had survived the night. But as he sat there, trembling in the dark, listening to the rotor blades overhead and the still ringing bell, he knew that survival and victory were two very different things. The sun was coming, yes, but the protocol had one last terrifying line. Until the ringing has ceased for a full daylight cycle. The night was over, but his ordeal was not. The bell was still ringing, and the sun offered no guarantee that the guests had truly left. The arrival of dawn was not the gentle, hopeful event Arthur had prayed for. It was a slow, agonizing crawl of gray light that seeped into the world, revealing the full extent of the night's devastation. The non-stop ringing of the bell did not falter with the rising sun. It continued its relentless assault, a brazen defiance of the natural order. If anything, the daylight made it worse. The horrors of the night had been shrouded in darkness, left to the terrifying canvas of the imagination. Now, the evidence was laid bare under the flat, unforgiving light of morning. From his hiding spot in the generator closet, Arthur listened as the helicopter retreated. He knew they wouldn't land. The protocol would be clear. No intervention until the conditions were met. The ringing had to stop. He stayed in the closet for another hour, then two. The silence from the main room was absolute. Finally, driven by a desperate need to see, to know, he unbraced himself from the door. His muscles screamed in protest. He slid the bolt back and cautiously pulled the door open. The scene in the main cabin was one of controlled demolition. A huge, jagged hole gaped in the ceiling, directly over the spot where he had huddled for much of the night. Chunks of timber, insulation, and roofing material littered the floor, and in the center of the debris field were tracks. They were not the tracks of any animal he knew. They were large, hoof-like prints, but with a horrifying addition. At the front of each print were the deep, sharp gouges of what could only be claws. The prints were heavy, sinking deep into the wooden floorboards, which were themselves splintered and scarred. The creature had been massive. It had walked around the room, its path visible in the debris. It had gone to the front door, where deep, parallel scratches marred the wood from top to bottom. It had gone to the window where he'd heard the woman's voice, and the shutter was hanging from a single hinge, clawed and chewed almost to splinters. And its path led directly to the utility closet where he had hidden. The door bore the deep indentations of its assault. He felt sick. The physical evidence was somehow more terrifying than the whispers in the dark. It made it real, tangible. He had not been losing his mind. He had been hunted. And through it all, the bell rang on. It was a soundtrack to the desolation, a mocking, triumphant peal that scraped at his raw nerves. He spent the day in a state of suspended terror. He couldn't eat. He couldn't rest. He just sat in the one corner of the room that wasn't covered in debris, the iron poker still in his hand, and he watched the hole in his roof, waiting. He listened to the bell, waiting. The protocol demanded he wait for the ringing to stop for a full daylight cycle. This meant that even if the bell fell silent at noon, he would have to endure the rest of the day, the entire coming night, and the following day before he could consider himself safe. The rule was designed for absolute certainty. But the bell showed no sign of stopping. It rang through the morning. It rang through the afternoon. The sound became a form of torture, a psychological drill boring into his skull. He started to hear things within the ringing voices, whispers, screams, all woven into the fabric of the ceaseless noise. He couldn't tell if they were real or if his mind was finally fracturing under the strain. As dusk began to fall on the second day, a new, deeper wave of despair washed over him. He had survived one night. He didn't have the strength to survive another. The cabin was breached. His flimsy sanctuary was ruined. The things could get in easily now. He considered his options. He could make a run for it, try to reach the perimeter of the preserve on foot. But he was miles from the edge, with no supplies and a wilderness that was now actively hostile. And he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to his core, that he would not get far. The bell was a beacon. It had called them, and it would guide them right to him. His only hope was the protocol: to wait, to endure. The sun set, and the world was plunged back into a darkness that felt thicker and more menacing than before. The bell rang on, its sound seeming to grow louder, more intimate in the gloom. He didn't need to wait long. As if on cue, with the last ray of sunlight disappearing, the sounds began again. This time there was no subtlety. There was no gentle tapping, no pleading voice. A guttural roar echoed from the forest, a sound of pure predatory rage, and it was answered by a chorus of chittering, clicking noises from the other side of the clearing. They weren't just testing the cabin anymore. They were coming for him. He heard them on the porch. Not one set of footsteps, but many. He heard them scrambling onto the roof. He saw a shape, large and dark, block out the moonlight as it positioned itself over the hole in the ceiling. Arthur didn't hide in the closet this time. There was no point. He scrambled under the heavy oak table in the center of the room, pulling a fallen section of the ceiling over himself like a makeshift shield. He was panting, tears of sheer terror streaming down his face. A heavy form dropped into the room with a floor-shaking thud. He could smell it, a rank, musky odor of damp earth, rot, and old meat. He peeked through a crack in his debris shield. He wished he hadn't. It was tall and gaunt, its limbs too long for its body. Its skin was the color of wet clay, and it was stretched tight over a frame that was horribly, unnaturally thin. Its head turned, and he saw a face with no discernible features, just a smooth expanse of skin, except for a wide, lipless mouth that opened far too wide, revealing rows of needle-like teeth. And it wasn't alone. Smaller, skittering things like spiders made of shadow and bone were crawling in through the broken window, their claws clicking on the floorboards. The large creature took a step, its head swiveling, its featureless face somehow conveying a sense of sniffing the air. It knew he was there. It was toying with him. The bell outside seemed to reach a fever pitch, a frantic, ecstatic scream. The creature took another step towards the table. Arthur squeezed his eyes shut, bracing for the end. He had been a fool. His arrogance had not just been a mistake. It had been a death sentence. He had scoffed at the old ways, and now the old ways had come to claim him. And then, a sound he had longed for more than anything in the world. Silence. The bell had stopped. In one moment, there was a hellish, deafening clangor. In the next, a silence so profound, so absolute, it was as disorienting as the noise had been. The creature in the room froze. The skittering things stopped their advance. He could hear them, a low, guttural chittering of what sounded like confusion, disappointment. From outside, The first rays of the sun, the dawn of the third day, pierced through the hole in the roof, a single brilliant shaft of golden light. The beam struck the large creature. It recoiled as if struck by a physical blow, letting out a thin, shrieking hiss that sounded like escaping steam. It scrambled backwards, its long limbs flailing, and in a blur of motion, it launched itself back up through the hole in the roof and was gone. The smaller things scurried back out of the window, vanishing into the shadows. Arthur lay under the table, trembling, not daring to believe it. The sun was rising, and the bell was silent. He waited. He waited for what felt like a lifetime, listening to the silence. It was over. It was finally over. The ringing had ceased. Now he just had to wait for one full daylight cycle. He had to survive one more day and one more night in silence. He thought he could do it. He thought he had made it. But the protocol had accounted for the bell. It had accounted for the creatures. It had not accounted for what the silence would leave behind. The silence was not a comfort. It was a canvas. And on that canvas, Arthur's shattered mind began to paint its own horrors. Every creak of the ruined cabin, every gust of wind, every rustle of a leaf outside was the return of the creatures. He saw them in the shadows, in the corner of his eye. The featureless face of the large one was burned into his memory, a permanent afterimage on his vision. He spent the third day in a state of near catatonia, huddled under his makeshift shelter, unable to move. The sun traced its path across the sky, its warmth doing nothing to dispel the profound cold that had settled deep in his bones. He was a prisoner of the final rule. He had to wait. As dusk fell on the third day, a new kind of terror gripped him, the terror of anticipation. He had survived the noise. He had survived the creatures. Could he survive a night of silent, agonizing waiting? A night where every shadow could hold a new threat? But the night passed in unnerving peace. No creatures came. No voices whispered. There was only the sound of his own ragged breathing and the wind in the trees. The silence held. When the sun rose on the fourth day, Arthur knew he was free. The daylight cycle was complete. He had survived. He crawled out from under the table. He was gaunt, filthy, his eyes wide and vacant in a face pale with exhaustion. He stumbled through the wreckage of his cabin, a ghost in the ruins of his former confidence. He made his way to the door and, with a trembling hand, slid back the deadbolt. The morning air was crisp and clean. The world outside was beautiful, serene, utterly indifferent to the horror he had endured. It was as if nothing had happened. He didn't wait. He got into his truck, the tires were miraculously intact, and he drove. He didn't look back at the cabin, at the forest, at the silent, waiting chapel in Sector Gamma. He just drove. He was picked up by a patrol team 20 miles from the outpost, walking down the center of a service road in a daze. He was hospitalized for severe dehydration, exhaustion, and what the official report called an acute psychotic break. Elias Thorne visited him in the hospital once. Arthur was sitting in a chair, staring at a blank wall. "You made it, son," Elias said, his voice soft. Arthur didn't look at him. He just shook his head, a slow, rhythmic motion. "The bell," he whispered, his voice a dry rasp. "It didn't stop." "What are you talking about, Art? We haven't heard it in 2 days. It's over." Arthur finally turned his head, and Elias felt a chill go through him. Arthur's eyes were focused on something far away, something no one else could see. "Oh, it stopped out there," Arthur whispered, a terrifyingly sane smile touching his lips. He tapped his temple with a trembling finger. "But it didn't stop in here. The still ringing. It never stops. Can't you hear it?" Arthur Vance was never cleared for active duty again. He was given a medical discharge and a generous pension, on the condition that he sign a non-disclosure agreement of formidable length and consequence. The official story was that he suffered a mental breakdown due to prolonged isolation. A tragic, but understandable case. We, at the protocol, know the truth. He was not broken by isolation. He was broken by revelation. He had looked behind the curtain, and he could not unsee what was there. The protocol for Outpost Echo-7 has since been amended. A new rule has been added, Rule 7. It reads simply, under no circumstances is any personnel to attempt to repair, reinforce, or otherwise interact with the structure of the old chapel. Its current state of decay is to be considered a feature, not a flaw. The bell remains silent. For now, it hangs in its dark steeple, waiting for another curious mind, another defiant soul who believes that all rules are made to be tested. The wilderness does not make threats. It makes promises. The protocols we establish are our best attempt to navigate those promises, to ensure we are not the ones who have to pay the price when they are kept. Arthur Vance paid that price. He refused to follow the protocol. And in the ringing silence of his own mind, he is paying it still. Thank you for joining us for this debriefing. The world is full of quiet places with loud histories and rules that should never be broken. Our work is to ensure the boundary holds. If you value this work and wish to stay informed, consider subscribing to the Wilderness Protocol. Turn on notifications so you never miss a report. The knowledge we share could be the one thing that keeps you safe when you find yourself on the edge of the map, where the old rules still apply. Stay safe, stay vigilant, and whatever you do, obey the protocol.